Hello, in this video, I want to start talking about the series that I'll kind of be doing in terms of thinking about the upcoming LD topic on space privatization. I'm really interested on this resolution because I definitely think that, because I've debated on a space resolution before myself, and so I have a lot of ideas about what some of the most popular arguments are usually to make on space privatization, and I have a lot of reflections on things that could be done better or worse, and so I think there are definitely a lot of things that could change in terms of what is happening in terms of space, the way in which we think about space in its relationship to questions of humanity, its relationship to questions of class mobility, and things that have been going on since the Cold War, and what the space race really is, and why it's such an important critical part of the way in which we think about international relations, and the way that we think about domestic relationships that happen socially as well, are all really interesting ways to consider the role that space and space exploration serves in terms of how we think about humanity and the types of desires we have as a society. And so in this video, I kind of want to start off by talking about that in the context of racial capitalism. I think that racial capitalism on the space privatization topic is one of the best critiques that can be made on the affirmative and the negative, because I feel it has so much in terms of entrenched into the history of space privatization, and the reason why space is kind of seen as this outside commodity that is necessary for us to be able to conquer and turn into a resource. And I think that it allows us to settle and think about that argument from various different historical contingencies that are really important to understand why racial that capitalism is so that space privatization is so necessary to the functioning of capitalism and to thinking about class mobility and its relationship to race as a whole. And that's something that I definitely want to talk about a little bit in this video. So starting off with what do I think is most pertinent about the critique of racial capitalism in relationship to space privatization. I think that this critique is super good and super important because I feel there are so many authors that are really thinking about the question of why space privatization exists. A lot of those authors are going to really draw back to Cold War imagery of what space meant, because this is when the space race between the US and Russia and other countries became extremely important. And so I think that it's a good place for us to start off where we're thinking about our analysis for people that are trying to think about what are the roles that racial capitalism serves in thinking about that Cold War, is that space represent this form of mobility in the terms of whiteness, especially within the US, to operate as this celebratory exploration that allowed for limitless possibility and freedom. JF Kennedy saw the operation of space as something that is necessary in order to prove the dominance of the US as this global entity. And so already space exploration is guided by the idea of white American freedom and the idea of an upward mobility into a space that opens up more freedom, etc. The reason why this is particularly interesting is because there are a lot of authors that are drawing the specific relationship between that type of Cold War propaganda and the way that it has been related to urban crises, and how it becomes militarized into counterinsurgent responses towards various types of movements that exist within the 1960s. It's so interesting because a lot of the authors talk about the way in which post World War II operated as a place where anti-racism was beginning to be recognized as a potential vision for how we're able to change the historical development of capitalism. But the way in which space becomes introduced as a particular crises for development ultimately allows for the further ghettoization of various types of black communities and the creation of black mobility, because of the way in which it operates as a space to get the financial development necessary in order to create forms of mobility into space. The farther in which whiteness and the way in which American freedom and liberalism are seen as signs of freedom, aka their ability to ascend into space and use it as a space for territorialization, the more they're also able to distance themselves from the ghettoization that happens on the ground, because of the way space operates as a place to remake and undo the violence that has been done within this space. I feel again, with a lot of criticisms, there needs to be a lot of arguments being done about how the claiming of the space of space exploration is this project that opens up a clean slate for us to think about human evolution and the development of humans as a whole, makes it incredibly important in terms of thinking about why it produces a particular very white liberal aesthetic for how we think about the relationship that space has to freedom, because the idea of space exploration itself doesn't actually change the terms in which people are able to mitigate or able to perform their freedom. Rather, it only creates a new avenue for the creation of a society that's already still invested in the same forms of anti-black promises and creations of technology and culture that have already been pushed in the status quo. I think that it's really interesting in the context of racial capitalism specifically, because I feel there are so many ways in which these private companies, whether it be SpaceX or whether it be public enterprises such as the government itself are able to like create the kind of like necessary like budgets and the necessary necessary kind of like finances in order to secure this kind of imaginative like space of freedom, or the idea of spatial exploration of freedom through processes of ghettoization. The idea of like the improvisation of like medical debt and the kind of like imposing of various types of like taxes and other forms of like carceral entities that we've talked about in terms of like how racial capitalism leads to things is directly related to questions of carcerality, all extend themselves here, because the way in which like public entities and public enterprises are able to make their money back and are able to kind of like financialize themselves is by continuing to produce a financial crisis or an urbanization crisis that like allows the continued ghettoization and expropriation of various black communities. And thus it kind of becomes a question of like, what is our kind of relationship to the question of like what we should do in the context of space. And I feel like both on the affirmative and the negative, it opens up really interesting opportunity to kind of talk about like what alternatives to like the human, what alternatives to capital we kind of take, or even what kind of like alternatives we take to our relationship to space that don't require us to assert that relationship through capital and through kind of like upward mobility. I feel like a lot of the arguments that need to be made are what are the ways in which you can like ensure that even as space exploration is kind of like this inevitability, what are the ways in which that kind of different epistemology or a different way of thinking about our relationship to the future can change the terms in which we do that space exploration in a way that doesn't like reforge the same types of colonization that are apparent in the way in which like a white Americanism has like taken over like the ways in which we think about like various types of positioning of like settling of indigenous populations and various types of colonized bodies, and also the way in which that kind of relates to the like increased ghettoization of various types of communities, whether it be those domestically in the U.S. or across the world. There's so many interesting ways to think about like how the parts and the necessary kind of like pieces and technology that are being used in order to create these programs are fostered by various investments in the apartheid in various African countries. Why it's invested in a particular way of being able to extract resource from the kind of like a production of like the ghettoization of particular populations in order to produce forms of white mobility that I feel like on the affirmative and negative offer really opportune ideas for the ways in which you can kind of refute some of the terms in which a lot of these arguments and like means for space exploration are being made. And so hopefully you'll tune into more of the stuff that I'll be doing about like racial capitalism, space privatization, and yeah, thank you as always for tuning in.